All right, everybody, I've cleaned off the light board for the next and final video here that we'll talk about. It's about the Kelvin-Benson cycle. So I'll draw it here. I'm not going to use green because it's not a photosynthetic thing. Use orange. Pretty good circle, pretty good circle. Kelvin-Benson cycle. This is where CO2 is actually brought into a chemical reaction. So we have along the cycle, a set of enzymes that actually just kind of bounce molecules around. So remembering that a cycle is not a physical thing, it's a collection of enzymes where as the cycle sort of progresses, the last thing that is produced is the reactant that the CO2, a reactant, essentially attaches to. So the cycle actually has two functions. It needs to do two things. It needs to actually produce the thing that is the objective. It actually needs to produce glucose in one way or the other. The other thing the cycle needs to do is keep cycling. So the glucose is not produced as the last part. The last part that's produced is the reactant that CO2 bonds to keep the whole thing going. So if you run out of this, the Kelvin-Benson cycle stops, even though glucose, which is the objective, happens all the way down here. So the cycle sort of keeps moving. So it is make glucose. And the next thing you need to do, it needs to keep going. It needs to make reactants. Make reactants so it can keep going. The enzyme that does this, that grabs onto the CO2, is called rubisco. Rubisco, I'm almost off the top of the thing. That's a fine. Rubisco, R-U-B-I-S-C-O. And CO2 will then combine to this reactant here. The enzyme rubisco facilitates that. And you'll start a series of reactions. ATP goes into this. NADPH goes into this. A couple of times, makes NADP, makes NADP. We're dropping off these electrons that we were holding on to. We make some ADP along the process, breaking that bond, putting some energy in to the cycle here, right? All kinds of places where energy is put into this cycle to sort of keep it moving, right? Ultimately resulting in glucose being produced and the reactants that we need to keep the thing going. Just like in the last video, I actually have the textbook picture that shows you what this looks like. Looks kind of like this. Here you see, here at the top, the CO2 is going in. Great. Here's our rubisco enzyme that's holding onto it. And it's the CO2 is bonding with a molecule called RUBP, ribulose biphosphate. And that's going to go over to the other side. That reaction is going to happen in the carbon fixation side of it. It's going to make 3-phosphoglycerate. ATP goes in, NADPH goes in, 6 of each. That's a lot. To make this molecule down here at the bottom called 3GP. Over here on my diagram, I said glucose is produced. 2 of those 3GPs get put together to make glucose, as it says in the diagram. More ATP is added to that reaction to make the RUBP to keep the cycle going. So this is the Calvin cycle. It's not big and huge and complicated like the Calvin cycle was. Sorry, like the Krebs cycle was, but there's enough complexity to it. You can see energy has to be invested into it in order to keep the thing going. And glucose, or the precursors of glucose, is an output, and the cycle needs to keep going, right? And once you've done this, you've taken the energy, which we have in the form of ATP and NADPH that we made in the light reactions, and here we've deployed that energy to actually make glucose and to keep the cycle going. And pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere up here at the top, as we know that CO2 does, which is great. So oxygen get kicked out as a waste product in the light reactions. CO2 going in the Calvin cycle, as a reactant. So that is photosynthesis in a nutshell. Hope you enjoyed it. Peace.